Humans have always been known for progressing extremely quickly. I mean, in just 1,000 years, we went from dying from a fever to watching YouTube at 3 a.m. on our magic screens. But throughout history, there's one thing that remained constant no matter where you lived and what you were doing. It's our never-ending desire to kill each other for absolutely no reason. Whether it was two cavemen fighting over who gets the last piece of mammoth, to full-scale international conflicts resulting in millions of deaths, we just can't resist fighting with ourselves. One of the biggest wars we've ever fought was World War II. Millions of people died, and countries were desperate to win the war. So desperate, in fact, that they would do almost anything to win the war, even creating weapons that were either a huge waste of money or ones that would break multiple animal abuse laws today. So here are some of the weirdest weapons ever used during World War II. Have you ever looked at your pet dog and thought, I wonder what would happen if I strapped some highly dangerous explosives onto it? Well, that's exactly what the Soviet Union military thought during World War II. Tanks were a big problem during the war because it was basically a moving missile launcher, except it had max health and your gun was as effective as a rock on a stick. The most common way to destroy tanks was to try and explode them, and this was normally done with grenades or mines. But the Soviets didn't like how easy to use and safe the grenades were, so they decided instead to train dogs to bring bombs to the tanks. For some reason, they didn't really think of the consequences of giving explosives that can kill people to something that chased its tail for hours on end. The dogs were supposed to detect the smell of diesel in the tank engine, go to the tank, and explode, destroying the tank and also traumatizing everyone nearby. Unfortunately, dogs aren't exactly the best at following instructions while all they could hear was the sounds of the world ending, so most of them were too scared to go to the tanks and just ran back to the Soviet owners, where they immediately exploded. Could this day get any worse? Oh boy, it sure did. During training, the dogs practiced on Soviet tanks, which ran on diesel. But during the war, the German tanks ran on gasoline. The dogs relied on their sense of smell to find the tanks, and the only tanks they recognized were the Soviet diesel ones. So, like the good dogs they were, they did what their owners wanted to and blew up the Soviet tanks. The program was eventually stopped when they realized the same animals that get scared by thunder weren't exactly going to be effective in an international war. Speaking of using living creatures as weapons, even the US was joining in on the animal abuse train with bat bombs. During World War II, Japan was mostly made of wood, which is great for building but not so great as a fire repellent. So, the US Army decided to firebomb Japanese cities, but they didn't really know how. Then they got a letter from a dental surgeon talking about a new weapon idea he had. As the story goes, he visited a park home to many species of bats and thought, I want to light these fuckers on fire. And so he wrote to the president at the time about his idea to light bats on fire and release them onto Japan to win the war. In his letter, he said that bats were the lowest form of life and their only purpose was to help Americans. Despite having no experience with bats or anything even remotely military related, the president actually took him seriously and started military research on bat bombs. I guess that $700 billion a year has to be spent somewhere. The bomb itself looked pretty normal, except it had air holes and was filled not with explosives but with 1,000 living flying bats with napalm glued to their bodies instead. Surprisingly, bat bombs didn't really become all that successful despite being created by a true military expert. Something the army didn't consider was that bats weren't very good at targeting a specific building when they were being barbecued alive 1,000 feet in the air. I mean, if your boss asked you to work overtime and then set you on fire, you'd probably run away too. When they were being tested, they flew around in random directions, as you would if you just burst into flames one day and ended up setting fire to an entire airbase. This project was eventually scrapped when Americans realized they didn't need thousands of bats to defeat the Japanese and just needed 2 of their boys. But not before spending $18 million of taxpayer money to make bat filet mignon. Gordon Ramsay would be proud. Now during World War II, Hitler really wanted to invade Britain and eventually conquer Europe, but to do that, he'd have to go through France. That normally wouldn't be that hard if it wasn't for the long wall on the border of France filled with forts, guns, and 7-meter thick concrete that the German army had to get through. Führer, we could bomb some forts along the wall or maybe try sneaking in through the forts. What do you think? Big gun. Excuse me, Führer? Big f***ing gun. And so, like any rational leader, Hitler built the biggest gun to ever exist on this planet so he could destroy the wall from his backyard. The Gustav gun, as it was called, was basically a missile launcher that weighed about 1,300 tons that could fire 7-ton shells. It was so big that it had to be broken down and assembled every time it was used. So the Germans started building it and were about to complete it when they realized that the country of Belgium existed and that they could just go through Belgium around the wall instead, making the gun practically useless. But Hitler wasn't going to let his $34 million wet dream go to waste, so he tried using it in other battles. but the fact that it couldn't be moved after setting it up and that it was so big just made it target practice for the enemy fighter planes. It was basically like holding up a giant sign saying, "Hey, here's a very expensive gun that took years to build. Please don't blow it up." Also, by the time the Gustav gun was set up at its location, the battle it was trying to fight would already be over. In the end, after firing only 250 shots in its lifetime, the Death Star of Nazi Germany was dismantled and scrapped. So yeah, those were some of the wacky and weird weapons that were used in World War II. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Next video will come out whenever I decide to get out of bed and make a new one, so I'll see you then.